Volume 2, Chapter 9 of Clayhanger, by Arnold BENNETT. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. In the Porch. When the front door of the Orgreaves interposed itself that night between Edwin and a little group of gas-lit faces, he turned away towards the warm gloom of the garden in a state of happy excitement. He had left fairly early, despite protests, because he wished to give his father no excuse for a spectacular display of wrath. Edwin's desire for a tranquil existence was growing steadily. But now that he was in the open air he did not want to go home. He wanted to be in full possession of himself, at leisure and in freedom, and to examine the treasure of his sensations. "It's been rather quiet," the Orgreaves had said. "We generally have people dropping in." Quiet! It was the least quiet evening he had ever spent. He was intoxicated, not with wine, though he had drunk wine. A group of well-intentioned philanthropists, organised into a powerful society for combating the fearful evils of alcoholism, had seized Edwin at the age of 12 and made him bind himself with solemn childish signature and ceremonies never to taste alcohol save by doctor's orders. He thought of this pledge in the garden of the Orgreaves. "Damned rot!" he murmured, and dismissed the pledge from his mind as utterly unimportant, if not fatuous. No remorse! The whole philosophy of asceticism inspired him at that moment with impatient scorn. It was the hope of pleasure that intoxicated him, the vision which he had had of the possibilities of being really interested in life. He saw new avenues towards joy, and the sight thereof made him tingle, less with the desire to be immediately at them than with the present ecstasy of contemplating them. He was conscious of actual physical tremors and agreeable smartings in his head, electrical disturbances. But he did not reason, he felt. He was passive, not active. He would not even just then attempt to make new plans. He was in a beatitude, his mouth unaware that it was smiling. TWO. Behind him was the lighted house, in front the gloom of the lawn ending in shrubberies and gates, with a street lamp beyond. And there was silence, save for the vast furnace breathings coming over undulating miles which the people of the Five Towns, hearing them always, never hear. A great deal of diffused light filtered through the cloudy sky. The warm wandering airs were humid on the cheek. He must return home. He could not stand dreaming all the night in the garden of the Orgreaves. To his right uprose the great rectangular mass of his father's new house, entirely free of scaffolding, having all the aspect of a house inhabited. It looked enormous. He was proud of it. In such an abode, and so close to the Orgreaves, what could he not do? Why go to gaze on it again? There was no common sense in doing so. And yet he felt: "I must have another glance at it before I go home." From his attitude towards it he might have been the creator of that house. That house was like one of his more successful drawings. When he had done a drawing that he esteemed, he was always looking at it. He would look at it before running down to breakfast, and after breakfast, instead of going straight to the shop, he would rush upstairs to have still another look at it. The act of inspection gave him pleasure. So with the house. Strange, superficially, but the simple explanation was that for some things he had the eyes of love. Yes, in his dancing and happy brain the impulse to revisit the house was not to be conquered. The few battered yards of hedge between his father's land and that of Mr Orgreave seemed more passable in the night. He crunched along the gravel, stepped carefully with noiseless foot on the flower bed, and then pushed himself right through the frail bushes, forgetting the respect due to his suit. The beginning of summer had dried the sticky clay of the new garden. Paths had already been traced on it, and trenches cut for the draining of the lawn that was to be. Edwin, in the night, saw the new garden finished, mellow, blooming with such blossoms as were sold in Saint Luke's Market. He had scarcely ever seen flowers growing in the mass. He saw himself reclining in the garden with a rare and beautiful book in his hand, while the sound of Beethoven's music came to him through the open window of the drawing-room. In so far as he saw Maggie at all, he saw her somehow mysteriously elegant and vivacious. He did not see his father. His fancy had little relation to reality, but this did not mar his pleasure. Then he saw himself talking over the hedge wittily to amiable and witty persons in the garden of the Orgreaves. THREE. He had not his key to the new house, but he knew a way of getting into it through the cellar. No reason in doing so; nevertheless he must get into it, must localise his dream in it. He crouched down under the blank east wall, and feet foremost disappeared slowly, as though the house were swallowing him. He stood on the stillage of the cellar and struck a match. Immense and weird, the cellar! And the doorless doorway leading to the cellar steps seemed to lead to affrighting matters. He was in the earth, in it, with the smells of damp mortar and of bricks, and of the earth itself about him. And above him rose the house, a room over him, and a room over that, and another over that, and then the chimney cowl up in the sky. He jumped from the stillage and went quickly to the doorway and saw the cellar steps. His heart was beating. He trembled. He was afraid, exquisitely afraid, acutely conscious of himself amid the fundamental mysteries of the universe. He reached the top of the steps as the match expired. After a moment he could distinguish the forms of things in the hall, even the main features of the pattern of the tiles. The small panes in the glazed front door, whose varied tints repeated those of the drawing-room window in daytime, now showed a uniform dull grey, lifeless. The cellar was formidable below, and the stairs curved upwards into the formidable. But he climbed them. The house seemed full of inexplicable noises. When he stopped to listen, he could hear scores of different infinitesimal sounds. His spine thrilled as if a hand delicate and terrible had run down it in a caress. All the unknown of the night and of the universe was pressing upon him, but it was he alone who had created the night and the universe. He reached his room, the room in which he meant to inaugurate the new life and the endeavour towards perfection. Already, after his manner, he had precisely settled where the bed was to be, and where the table, and all the other objects of his world. There he would sit and read rare and beautiful books in the original French. And there he would sit to draw. And to the right of the hearth over bookshelves would be such and such a picture, and to the left of the hearth over bookshelves such and such another picture. Only now he could not dream in the room as he had meant to dream, because beyond the open door was the empty landing and the well of the stairs and all the terror of the house. The terror came and mingled with the delicious sensations that had seized him in the solitude of the garden of the Orgreaves. No, never had he been so intensely alive as then. He went cautiously to the window and looked forth. Instantly the terror of the house was annihilated. It fell away, was gone. He was not alone in his fancy-created universe. The reassuring illusion of reality came back like a clap of thunder. He could see a girl insinuating herself through the gap in the hedge which he had made 10 minutes earlier. FOUR. "What the deuce is she after?" he muttered. He wondered whether, if she happened to glance upwards, she would be able to see him. He stood away a little from the window, but as in the safer position he could no longer distinguish her, he came again close to the glass. After all, there could be no risk of her seeing him. And if she did see him, the fright would be hers, not his. Having passed through the hedge, she stopped, bent down, leaning backward and to one side, and lifted the hem of her skirt to examine it. Possibly it was torn. Then she dropped it. By that black tight skirt and by something in her walk he knew she was Hilda. He could not decipher her features. She moved towards the new house very slowly, as if she had emerged for an aimless nocturnal stroll. Strange and disquieting creature! He peered as far as he could leftwards to see the west wall of Lane End House. In a window of the upper floor a light burned. The family had doubtless gone to bed, or were going. And she had wandered forth solitary, and was trespassing in his garden. Cheek! If ever he got an opportunity he should mysteriously tease her on the subject of illegal night excursions. Yes, he should be very witty and ironic. Nothing but cheek! He was confirmed in his hostility to her. She had no charm, and yet the entire Orgreave family was apparently infatuated about her. Her interruption on behalf of Victor Hugo seemed to be savage. Girls ought not to use that ruthless tone. And her eyes were hard, even cruel. She was less feminine than masculine. Her hair was not like a girl's hair. She still came on until the projecting roof of the bay window beneath him hid her from sight. He would have opened his window and leaned out to glimpse her, could he have done so without noise. Where was she? In the garden porch? She did not reappear. She might be capable of getting into the house. She might even then actually be getting into the house. She was queer, incalculable. Supposing that she was in the habit of surreptitiously visiting the house, and had found a key to fit one of the doors? Or supposing that she could push up a window? She would doubtless mount the stairs and trap him. Absurd, these speculations, as absurd as a nightmare! But they influenced his conduct. He felt himself forced to provide against the wildest hazards. Abruptly he departed from the bedroom and descended the stairs, stamping, clumping, with all possible noise. In addition he whistled. This was to warn her to fly. He stopped in the hall until she had had time to fly, and then he lit a match as a signal which surely no carelessness could miss. He could have gone direct by the front door into the street, so leaving her to her odd self. But instead he drew back the slip catch of the garden door and opened it, self-consciously humming a tune. She was within the porch. She turned deliberately to look at him. He could feel his heartbeats. His cheeks burned, and yet he was chilled. "Who's there?" he asked. But he did not succeed, to his own satisfaction, in acting alarmed surprise. "Me," said Hilda, challengingly, rudely. "Oh!" he murmured, at a loss. "Did you want me? Did anyone want me?" "Yes," she said. "I just wanted to ask you something." She paused. He could not see her scowling, but it seemed to him that she must be. He remembered that she had rather thick eyebrows, and that when she brought them nearer together by a frown, they made almost one continuous line, the effect of which was not attractive. "Did you know I was in here?" "Yes. That's my bedroom window over there. I've left the gas up. And I saw you get through the hedge, so I came down. They'd all gone off to bed except Tom, and I told him I was just going a walk in the garden for a bit. They never worry me, you know. They let me alone. I knew you'd got into the house by the light." "But I only struck a match a second ago," he protested. "Excuse me," she said coldly. "I saw a light quite 5 minutes ago." "Oh yes," he apologised. "I remember. When I came up the cellar steps." "I dare say you think it's very queer of me," she continued. "Not at all," he said quickly. "Yes, you do," she bitterly insisted. "But I want to know. Did you mean it when you said, at supper, that there's no virtue in believing?" "Did I say there was no virtue in believing?" he stammeringly demanded. "Of course you did!" she remonstrated. "Do you mean to say you can say a thing like that and then forget about it? If it's true, it's one of the most wonderful things that were ever said. And that's why I wanted to know if you meant it, or whether you were only saying it because it sounded clever. That's what they're always doing in that house, being clever." Her tone was invariably harsh. "Yes," he said simply. "I meant it. Why?" "You did?" Her voice seemed to search for insincerity. "Well, thank you. That's all. It may mean a new life to me. I'm always trying to believe. Always. Aren't you?" "I don't know," he mumbled. "How do you mean?" "Well, you know!" she said, as if impatiently smashing his pretence of not understanding her. "But perhaps you do believe." He thought he detected scorn for a facile believer. "No," he said, "I don't. And it doesn't worry you? Honestly? Don't be clever. I hate that." "No," he said. "Don't you ever think about it?" "No, not often." "Charlie does." "Has he told you?" So she talks to the Sunday too, he reflected. "Yes, but of course I quite see why it doesn't worry you, if you honestly think there's no virtue in believing." "Well," said Edwin, "is there?" The more he looked at it through her eyes, the more wonderful profundities he discovered in that remark of his, which at the time of uttering it had appeared to him a simple platitude. It went exceedingly deep in many directions. "I hope you're right," she replied. Her voice shook. FIve. There was silence. To ease the strain of his self-consciousness, Edwin stepped down from the stone floor of the porch to the garden. He felt rain, and he noticed that the sky was very much darker. "By Jove!" he said. "It's beginning to rain, I do believe." "I thought it would," she answered. A squall of wind suddenly surged rustling through the high trees in the garden of the Orgreaves, and the next instant threw a handful of wild raindrops on his cheek. "You'd better stand against the other wall," he suggested. "You'll catch it there, if it keeps on." She obeyed. He returned to the porch, but remained in the exposed portion of it. "Better come here," she said, indicating somehow her side. "Oh, I'm all right." "You needn't be afraid of me," she snapped. He grinned awkwardly, but said nothing, for he could not express his secret resentment. He considered the girl to be of exceedingly unpleasant manners. "Would you mind telling me the time?" she asked. He took out his watch, but peer as he might he could not discern the position of the hands. "Half a second," he said, and struck a match. The match was blown out before he could look at the dial, but by its momentary flash he saw Hilda pressed against the wall. Her lips were tight, her eyes blazing, her hands clenched. She frowned. She was pale, and especially pale by contrast with the black of her plain austere dress. "If you'll come into the house," he said, "I can get a light there." The door was ajar. "No, thanks," she declined. "It doesn't really matter what time it is, does it? Good night." He divined that she was offering her hand. He clasped it blindly in the dark. He could not refuse to shake hands. Her hand gave his a feverish and lingering squeeze, which was like a contradicting message in the dark night, as though she were sending through her hand a secret denial of her spoken accents and her frown. He forgot to answer her "good night." A trap rattled furiously up the road. Yes, only 6 yards off, on the other side of the boundary wall, was the public road, and he standing hidden there in the porch with this girl whom he had seen for the first time that evening. It was the mail cart rushing to Knype. She did not move. She had said "good night" and shaken hands, and yet she remained. They stood speechless. Then, without warning, after perhaps a minute that seemed like 10 minutes, she walked away slowly into the rain. And as she did so, Edwin could just see her straightening her spine and throwing back her shoulders with a proud gesture. "I say, Miss Lessways," he called in a low voice. But he had no notion of what he wanted to say. Only her departure had unlocked his throat. She made no sign. Again he grinned awkwardly, a little ashamed of her, and a little ashamed of himself, because neither had behaved as woman or man of the world. After a short interval he followed in her steps as far as the gap in the hedge, which he did not find easily. There was no sign of her. The gas burned serenely in her bedroom, and the window was open. Then he saw the window close up a little, and an arm in front of the drawn blind. The rain had apparently ceased. Six. "Well, that's an eye-opener, that is," he murmured, and thereby expressed the situation. Of all the damned impudence! He somewhat overstated his feelings, because he was posing a little to himself. An accident that sooner or later happens to every man. And she'll go back and make out to Master Tom that she's just had a stroll in the garden. Garden, indeed! And yet they're all so fearfully stuck on her. He nodded his head several times reflectively, as if saying, "Well, well, what next?" And he murmured aloud, "So that's how they carry on, is it?" He meant, of course, women. He was very genuinely astounded. But the chief of all his acute sensations in that moment was pride, sheer pride. He thought, what 99 men out of 100 would have thought in such circumstances. "She's taken a fancy to me." Useless to call him a conceited coxcomb, from disgust that he did not conform to a sentimentally idealistic standard. He thought, "She's taken a fancy to me." And he was not a conceited coxcomb. He exulted in the thought. Nothing had ever before so startled and uplifted him. It constituted the supreme experience of his career as a human being. The delightful and stimulating experience of his evening in the house of the Orgreaves sank into unimportance by the side of it. The new avenues towards joy which had been revealed to him appeared now to be quite unexciting paths. He took them for granted. And he forgot the high and serious mood of complex emotion in which he had entered the new house. Music and the exotic flavours of a foreign language seemed a little thing, in comparison with the feverish hand clasp of the girl whom he so peculiarly disliked. The lifeless hand which he had taken in the drawing room of the Orgreaves could not be the same hand as that which had closed intimately on his under the porch. She must have two right hands. And even more base than his coxcombry, he despised her because it was he, Edwin, to whom she had taken a fancy. He had not sufficient self-confidence to justify her fancy in his own eyes. His argument actually was that no girl worth having could have taken a fancy to him at sight. Thus he condemned her for her faith in him. As for his historic remark about belief, well, there might or might not be something in that. Perhaps there was something in it. One instant he admired it, and the next he judged it glib and superficial. Moreover, he had conceivably absorbed it from a book. But even if it were an original epigrammatic pearl, was that an adequate reason for her following him to an empty house at dead of night? Of course an overwhelming passion might justify such behaviour. He could recall cases in literature. Yes, he had got so far as to envisage the possibility of overwhelming passion. Then all these speculations disconcertingly vanished, and Hilda presented herself to his mind as a girl intensely religious, who would shrink from no unconventionality in the pursuit of truth. He did not much care for this theory of Hilda, nor did it convince him. "Imagine marrying a girl like that!" he said to himself disdainfully. And he made a catalogue of her defects of person and of character. She was severe, satiric, merciless. "And I suppose, if I were to put my finger up," thus ran on his despicable ideas. Janet Orgreave now! Janet had every quality that he could desire, that he could even think of. Janet was balm. "You needn't be afraid," that unpleasant girl had said, and he had only been able to grin in reply. Still, pride, intense masculine pride! There was one thing he had liked about her, that straightening of the spine and setting back of the shoulders as she left him. She had in her some tinge of the heroic. He quitted the garden, and as soon as he was in the street he remembered that he had not pulled to the garden door of the house. "Dash the confounded thing!" he exploded, returning. But he was not really annoyed. He would not have been really annoyed even if he had had to return from half way down Trafalgar Road. Everything was a trifle save that a girl had run after him under such romantic circumstances. The circumstances were not strictly romantic, but they so seemed to him. Going home he did not meet a soul. Only in the middle distance of one of the lower side streets he espied a policeman. Trafalgar Road was a solitude of bright and forlorn gas lamps and dark, excluding facades. Suddenly he came to the corner of Wedgwood Street. He had started from Bleakridge. He had arrived at home. The interval between these two events was a perfect blank, save for the policeman. He could not recall having walked all the way down the road, and as he put the key into the door he was not in the least disturbed by the thought that his father might not have gone to bed. He went upstairs with a certain swaggering clatter, as who should say to all sleepers and bullies, "You be damned, I don't care for any of you. Something's happened to me." And he mused, "If anybody had told me this afternoon that before midnight I should..." Volume 2, Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Clayhanger by Arnold Bennett. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. The Centenary. It was immediately after this that the Centenary, mispronounced in every manner conceivable, began to obsess the town. Superior and aloof persons, like the Orgreaves, had for weeks heard a good deal of vague talk about the Centenary from people whom intellectually they despised, and had condescended to the Centenary as an amiable and excusable affair which lacked interest for them. They were wrong. Edwin had gone further, and had sniffed at the Centenary to every one except his father, and Edwin was especially wrong. On the antepenultimate day of June he first uneasily suspected that he had committed a fault of appraisement. That was when his father brusquely announced that by request of the Mayor all places of business in the town would be closed in honour of the Centenary. It was the Centenary of the establishment of Sunday schools. Edwin hated Sunday schools. Nay, he venomously resented them, though they had long ceased to incommode him. They were connected in his memory with atrocious tedium, pietistic insincerity, and humiliating contacts. At the bottom of his mind he still regarded them as a malicious device of parents for wilfully harassing and persecuting inoffensive helpless children. And he had a particular grudge against them because he alone of his father's offspring had been chosen for the nauseating infliction. Why should his sisters have been spared and he doomed? He became really impatient when Sunday schools were under discussion, and from mere irrational annoyance he would not admit that Sunday schools had any good qualities whatever. He knew nothing of their history, and wished to know nothing. Nevertheless, when the day of the Centenary dawned, and dawned in splendour, he was compelled, even within himself, to treat Sunday schools with more consideration. And in fact for 2 or 3 days previously the gathering force of public opinion had been changing his attitude from stern hatred to a sort of half-hearted derision. Now the derision was mysteriously transformed into an inimical respect. By what? By he knew not what. By something without a name in the air which the mind breathes. He felt it at 6 o'clock ere he arose. Lying in bed he felt it. The day was to be a festival. The shop would not open, nor the printing office. The work of preparing for the removal would be suspended. The way of daily life would be quite changed. He was free. That was, nearly free. He said to himself that of course his excited father would expect him to witness the celebrations and to wear his best clothes, and that was a bore. But therein he was not quite honest, for he secretly wanted to witness the celebrations and to wear his best clothes. His curiosity was hungry. He admitted what many had been asserting for weeks, that the Centenary was going to be a big thing, and his social instinct wished him to share in the pride of it. "It's a grand day!" exclaimed his father, cheerful and all glossy, as he looked out on Duck Square before breakfast. "It'll be rare and hot." And it was a grand day, one of the dazzling, spectacular, blue and gold days of early summer. And Maggie was in finery, and Edwin too. Useless for him to pretend that a big thing was not afoot, and his father in a white waistcoat. Breakfast was positively talkative, though the conversation was naught but a repeating and repeating of what the arrangements were, and of what everybody had decided to do. The three lingered over breakfast because there was no reason to hurry. And then even Maggie left the sitting room without a care, for though Clara was coming for dinner, Mrs Nixon could be trusted. Mrs Nixon, if she had time, would snatch half an hour in the afternoon to see what remained to be seen of the show. Families must eat, and if Mrs Nixon was stopped by duty from assisting at this centenary, she must hope to be more at liberty for the next. TWO. At 9 o'clock, in a most delicious mood of idleness, Edwin strolled into the shop. His father had taken down one shutter from the doorway and slanted it carelessly against another on the pavement. A blind man or a drunkard might have stumbled against it and knocked it over. The letters had been hastily opened. Edwin could see them lying in disorder on the desk in the little office. The dust sheets thought the day was Sunday. He stood in the narrow aperture and looked forth. Duck Square was a shimmer of sunshine. The Dragon and the Duck and the other public house at the top corner seemed as usual stolidly confident in the thirst of populations. But the borough dining rooms, next door but one to the corner of Duck Square and Wedgwood Street, were not as usual. The cart of Doy the butcher had halted laden in front of the borough dining rooms, and the anxious proprietor, attended by his two little daughters, aproned and sleeved for hard work in imitation of their stout perspiring mother, was accepting unusual joints from it. Ticklish weather for meat. You could see that from the man's gestures. Even on ordinary days those low-ceilinged dining rooms, stretching far back from the street in a complicated vista of interiors, were apt to be crowded, for the quality of the eightpenny dinner could be relied upon. Edwin imagined what a stifling, deafening inferno of culinary odours and clatter there would be at 1 o'clock, at 2 o'clock. 3 hokey-pokey ice-cream hand-carts, one after another, turned the corner of Trafalgar Road and passed in front of him along Wedgwood Street. 3! The men pushing them, one an Italian, seemed to wear nothing but shirt and trousers, with a straw hat above and vague slippers below. The steam cart lumbered up out of the valley of the road and climbed Duck Bank, throwing its enormous shadow to the left. It was half full of bright frocks and suits. An irregular current of finery was setting into the gates of the Wesleyan School yard at the top of the bank, and ceremoniously bedecked individuals of all ages hurried in this direction and in that, some with white handkerchiefs over flowered hats, a few beneath parasols. All the town's store of Sunday clothes was in use. The humblest was crudely gay. Pawnbrokers had full tills and empty shops for 24 hours. Then a procession appeared out of Moorthorne Road, from behind the Wesleyan chapel keeper's house, and as it appeared it burst into music. First a purple banner upheld on crimson poles with gilded lance points, then a brass band in full note, and then children, 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 little, middling, and big. As the procession curved down into Trafalgar Road, it grew in stature, until, towards the end of it, the children were as tall as the adults, who walked fussily as hens, proudly as peacocks on its flank. And last came a railway lorry on which dozens of tiny infants had been penned, and the horses of the lorry were ribboned and their manes and tails tightly plaited. On that grand day they could not be allowed to protect themselves against flies. They were sacrificial animals. A power not himself drew Edwin to the edge of the pavement. He could read on the immense banner, "Moorthorne St. John's Sunday School." These, then, were church folk, and indeed the next moment he descried a curate among the peacocks. The procession made another curve into Wedgwood Street, on its way to the supreme rendezvous in St Luke's Square. The band blared, the crimson cheeks of the trumpeters sucked in and out, the drum man leaned backwards to balance his burden, and banged. Every soul of the variegated company, big and little, was in a perspiration. The staggering bearers of the purple banner, who held the great poles in leathern sockets slung from the shoulders, and their acolytes before and behind, who kept the banner upright by straining at crimson halyards, sweated most of all. Every foot was grey with dust, and the dark trousers of boys and men showed dust. The steamy whiff of humanity struck Edwin's nostrils. Up hill and down dale the procession had already walked over 2 miles. Yet it was alert, joyous, and expectant, a chattering procession. From the lorry rose a continuous faint shriek of infantile voices. Edwin was saddened as by pathos. I believe that as he gazed at the procession waggling away along Wedgwood Street, he saw Sunday schools in a new light. And that was the opening of the day. There were to be dozens of such processions. Some would start only in the town itself, but others were coming from the villages like Red Cow, 5 sultry miles off. THREE. A young woman under a sunshade came slowly along Wedgwood Street. She was wearing a certain discreet amount of finery, but her clothes did not fit well, and a thin mantle was arranged so as to lessen as much as possible the obviousness of the fact that she was about to become a mother. The expression of her face was discontented and captious. Edwin did not see her until she was close upon him, and then he immediately became self-conscious and awkward. "Hello, Clara!" he greeted her, with his instinctive warm transient smile, holding out his hand sheepishly. It was a most extraordinary and amazing thing that he could never regard the ceremony of shaking hands with a relative as other than an affectation of punctilio. Happily he was not wearing his hat. Had it been on his head he would never have taken it off, and yet would have cursed himself for not doing so. "We are grand!" exclaimed Clara, limply taking his hand and dropping it as an article of no interest. In her voice there was still some echo of former sprightliness. The old Clara in her had not till that moment beheld the smart and novel curves of Edwin's Shillitoe suit, and the satiric cry came unbidden from her heart. Edwin gave an uneasy laugh, which was merely the outlet for his disgust. Not that he was especially disgusted with Clara, for indeed marriage had assuaged a little the tediousness of some of her mannerisms, even if it had taken away from her charm. He was disgusted more comprehensively by the tradition, universal in his class and in most classes, according to which relatives could not be formally polite to one another. He obeyed the tradition as slavishly as anyone, but often said to himself that he would violate the sacred rule if only he could count on a suitable response. He knew that he could not count on a suitable response, and he had no mind to be in the excruciating position of one who, having started "God Save the Queen" at a meeting, finds himself alone in the song. Why could not he and Clara behave together as, for instance, he and Janet Orgreave would behave together, with dignity, with worldliness, with mutual deference? But no, it was impossible, and would ever be so. They had been too brutally intimate, and the result was irremediable. "She's got no room to talk about personal appearance, anyway," he thought sardonically. There was another extraordinary and amazing thing. He was ashamed of her condition. He could not help the feeling. In vain he said to himself that her condition was natural and proper. In vain he remembered the remark of the sage that a young woman in her condition was the most beautiful sight in the world. He was ashamed of it. And he did not think it beautiful; he thought it ugly. It worried him. What? His sister? Other men's sisters, yes, but his? He forgot that he himself had been born. He could scarcely bear to look at Clara. Her face was thin and changed in colour. Her eyes were unnaturally lustrous and large, bold and fatigued. She looked ill, really ill, and she was incredibly unornamental. And this was she whom he could remember as a graceful child! And it was all perfectly correct and even laudable. So much so that young Clara undoubtedly looked down now, as from a superior height, upon both himself and Maggie. "Where's father?" she asked. "Just shut my sunshade." "Oh, somewhere about. I expect he'll be along in a minute." "Albert coming?" He followed her into the shop. "Albert!" she protested, shocked. "Albert can't possibly come till 1 o'clock. Didn't you know he's one of the principal stewards in Saint Luke's Square? He says we aren't to wait dinner for him if he isn't prompt." "Oh!" Edwin replied, and put the sunshade on the counter. Clara sat down heavily on a chair and began to fan herself with a handkerchief. In spite of the heat of exercise, her face was of a pallid yellow. "I suppose you're going to stay here all morning?" Edwin inquired. "Well," said Clara, "you don't see me walking up and down the streets all morning, do you? Albert said I was to be sure and go upstairs at once and not move. He said there'd be plenty to see for a long time yet from the sitting room window, and then afterwards I could lie down." "Albert said, Albert said." Clara's intonation of this frequent phrase always jarred on Edwin. It implied that Albert was the supreme fount of wisdom and authority in Bursley, whereas to Edwin Albert was in fact a mere tedious, self-important manufacturer in a small way, with whom he had no ideas in common. A decent fellow at bottom, the fastidious Edwin was bound to admit to himself by reason of slight glimpses which he had had of Albert's uncouth good nature, but pietistic, overbearing, and without humour. "Where's Maggie?" Clara demanded. "I think she's putting her things on," said Edwin. "But didn't she understand I was coming early?" Clara's voice was querulous, and she frowned. "I don't know," said Edwin. He felt that if they remained together for hours he and Clara would never rise above this plane of conversation, personal, factual, perfectly devoid of wide interest. They would never reach an exchange of general ideas; they never had done. He did not think that Clara had any general ideas. "I hear you're getting frightfully thick with the Orgreaves," Clara observed, with a malicious accent and smile, as if to imply he was getting frightfully above himself, and, simultaneously, that the Orgreaves were after all no better than other people. "Who told you that?" He walked towards the doorway uneasily. The worst was that he could not successfully pretend that these sisterly attacks were lost on him. "Never mind who told me," said Clara. Her voice took on a sudden charming roguish quality, and he could hear again the girl of 14. His heart at once softened to her. The impartial and unmoved spectator that sat somewhere in Edwin, as in everybody who possesses artistic sensibility, watching his secret life as from a conning tower, thought how strange this was. He stared out into the street. And then a face appeared at the aperture left by the removed shutter. It was Janet Orgreave's, and it hesitated. Edwin gave a nervous start. FOUR. Janet was all in white again, and her sunshade was white, with regular circular holes in it to let through spots of sunlight which flecked her face. Edwin had not recovered from the blow of her apparition just at that moment, when he saw Hilda Lessways beyond her. Hilda was slate-coloured, and had a black sunshade. His heart began to thump. It might have been a dramatic and dangerous crisis that had suddenly come about. And to Edwin the situation did in fact present itself as critical. His sister behind, and these two so different girls in front. Yet there was nothing critical in it whatsoever. He shook hands, as in a dream, wondering what he should do, trying to summon out of himself the man of the world. "Do come in," he urged them, hoping they would refuse. "Oh no, we mustn't come in," said Janet, smiling gratefully. Hilda did not smile. She had not even smiled in shaking hands, and she had shaken hands without conviction. Edwin heard a hurried step in the shop, and then the voice of Maggie, maternal and protective, in a low exclamation of surprise. "You dear!" And then the sound of a smacking kiss, and Clara's voice, thin, weak, and confiding. "Yes, I've come." "Come upstairs, do," said Maggie imploringly. "Come and be comfortable." Then steps ceasing to be heard as the sisters left the shop at the back. The solicitude of Maggie for Clara during the last few months had seemed wonderful to Edwin, as also Clara's occasional childlike acceptance of it. "But you must come in," he said more boldly to the visitors, asking himself whether either Janet or Hilda had caught sight of his sisters in the gloom of the shop. They entered, Hilda stiffly. Each, with the same gesture, closed her parasol before passing through the slit between the shutters into the deep shade. But whereas Janet smiled with pleasant anticipation, as though she was going into heaven, Hilda wrinkled her forehead when her parasol would not subside at the first touch. Janet talked of the Centenary, said they had decided only that morning to come down into the town and see whatever was to be seen, said with an angelic air of apologising to the Centenary that up at Lane End House they had certainly been underestimating its importance and its interest as a spectacle; said that it was most astonishing to see all the shops closed; and Edwin interjected vague replies, pulling the chair out of the little ebonised cubicle so that they could both sit down; and Hilda remained silent, and Edwin's thoughts were diving darkly beneath Janet's chatter, as in a deep sea beneath light waves. He heard and answered Janet with a minor part of his being that functioned automatically. "She's a caution," reflected the main Edwin, obsessed in secret by Hilda Lessways. Who could have guessed, by looking at her, that only 3 evenings before she had followed him in the night to question him, to squeeze his hand, and to be rude to him? Did Janet know? Did anyone? No. He felt sure that he and she had the knowledge of that interview to themselves. She sat down glum, almost glowering. She was no more worldly than Maggie and Clara were worldly. Than they, she had no more skill to be sociable, and in appearance she was scarcely more stylish. But she was not as they, and it was useless vindictively to disparage her by pretending that she was. She could be passionate concerning Victor Hugo. She was capable of disturbing herself about the abstract question of belief. He had not heard her utter a single word in the way of common girlish conversation. The doubt again entered his mind whether indeed her visit to the porch of the new house had been due to a genuine interest in abstract questions, and not to a fancy for himself. Yes, he reflected, that must have been it. In 2 days his pride in the affair had lost its first acuteness, though it had continued to brighten every moment of his life, and though he had not ceased to regret that he had no intimate friend to whom he could recount it in solemn and delicious intimacy. Now, philosophically, he stamped on his pride as on a fire, and he affected to be relieved at the decision that the girl had been moved by naught but a sort of fanaticism. But he was not relieved by the decision. The decision itself was not genuine. He still clung to the notion that she had followed him for himself. He preferred that she should have taken a fancy to him, even though he discovered no charm in her, no beauty, no solace, nothing but matter for repulsion. He wanted her to think of him, in spite of his distaste for her, to think of him hopelessly. "You are an ass," murmured the impartial watcher in the conning tower. And he was. But he did not care. It was agreeable thus to be an ass. His pride flared up again, and instead of stamping he blew on it. "By Jove," he thought, eyeing her slyly, "I'll make you show your hand. You see if I don't. You think you can play with me, but you can't." He was as violent against her as if she had done him an injury instead of having squeezed his hand in the dark. Was it not injurious to have snapped at him when he refused her invitation to stand by her against the wall in the porch? "You needn't be afraid." Janet would never have said such a thing. If only she resembled Janet! During all this private soliloquising, Edwin's mien of mild nervousness never hardened to betray his ferocity, and he said nothing that might not have been said by an innocuous idiot. The paper boy, arrayed richly, slipped apologetically into the shop. He had certain packets to take out for delivery, and he was late. Edwin nodded to him distantly. The conversation languished. Then the head of Mr Orgreave appeared in the aperture. The architect seemed amused. Edwin could not understand how he had ever stood in awe of Mr Orgreave, who, with all his distinction and expensiveness, was the most companionable person in the world. "Oh, father!" cried Janet. "What a deceitful thing you are! Do you know, Mr Edwin, he pooh-poohed us coming down. He said he was far too busy for such childish things as centenaries. And look at him!" Mr Orgreave, whose suit, hat, and necktie were a harmony of elegant greys, smiled with paternal ease, and swung his cane. "Come along now! Don't let's miss anything! Come along! Now, Edwin, you're coming, aren't you?" "Did you ever see such a child?" murmured Janet, adoring him. Edwin turned to the paper boy. "Just find my father before you go," he commanded. "Tell him I've gone, and ask him if you are to put the shutter up." The paper boy respectfully promised obedience, and Edwin was glad that the forbidding Hilda was there to witness his authority. Janet went out first. Hilda hesitated, and Edwin, having taken his hat from its hook in the cubicle, stood attending her at the aperture. He was sorry that he could not run upstairs for a walking stick. At last she seemed to decide to leave, yet left with apparent reluctance. Edwin followed, giving a final glance at the boy who was tying a parcel hurriedly. Mr Orgreave and his daughter were 10 yards off, arm in arm. Edwin fell into step with Hilda Lessways. Janet looked round and smiled and beckoned. "I wonder," said Edwin to himself, "what the devil's going to happen now? I'll take my oath she stayed behind on purpose." Well! This swaggering audacity was within. Without, even a skilled observer could have seen nothing but a faint sheepish smile. And his heart was thumping again. Volume 2, Chapter 10. Of Clayhanger by Arnold BENNETT. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER 11. The Bottom of the Square. Another procession, that of the Old Church Sunday School, came up, with standards floating and drums beating, out of the steepness of Woodisun Bank, and turned into Wedgwood Street, which thenceforward was loosely thronged by procession and sightseers. The importance of the festival was now quite manifest, for at the end of the street could be seen Saint Luke's Square, massed with human beings in movement. Osmond Orgreave and his daughter were lost to view in the brave crowd. But after a little Edwin distinctly saw Janet Sunshade leave Wedgwood Street at the corner of the Wedgwood Institution and bob slowly into the Cock Yard, which was a narrow thoroughfare leading to the market place and the Town Hall, and so to the top of Saint Luke's Square. He said nothing, and kept straight on along Wedgwood Street past the Covered Market. "I hope you didn't catch cold in the rain the other night," he remarked, grimly as he thought. "I should have thought it would have been you who were more likely to catch cold," Hilda replied, in her curt manner. She looked in front of her. The words seemed to him to carry a double meaning. Suddenly she moved her head, glanced full at him for an instant, and glanced behind her. "Where are they?" she inquired. "The others? Aren't they in front? They must be somewhere about." Unless she also had marked their deviation into the Cock Yard, why had she glanced behind her in asking where they were? She knew as well as he that they had started in front. He could only deduce that she had been as willing as himself to lose Mr Orgreave and Janet. Just then an acquaintance raised his hat to Edwin in acknowledgement of the lady's presence, and he responded with pride. Whatever his private attitude to Hilda, he was undeniably proud to be seen in the streets with a disdainful, aloof girl unknown to the town. It was an experience entirely new to him, and it flattered him. He desired to look long at her face, to examine her expression, to make up his mind about her, but he could not, because they were walking side by side. The sole manifestation of her that he could judge was her voice. It was a remarkable voice, rather deep, with a sort of chiselled intonation. The cadences of it fell on the ear softly and yet ruthlessly, and when she had finished speaking you became aware of silence, as after a solemn utterance of destiny. What she happened to have been saying seemed to be immaterial to the effect, which was physical, vibratory. TWO. At the border of Saint Luke's Square, junction of 8 streets, true centre of the town's traffic and the sole rectangular open space enclosed completely by shops, they found a line of constables which yielded only to processions and to the bearers of special rosettes. The Square, as it was called by those who inhabited it, had been chosen for the historic scene of the day because of its pre-eminent claim and suitability. The least of its advantages, its slope, from the top of which it could be easily dominated by a speaker on a platform, would alone have secured for it the honours of the centenary. As the police cordon closed on the procession from the old church, definitely dividing the spectators from the spectacle, it grew clear that the spectators were in the main a shabby lot, persons without any social standing, unkempt idlers, good-for-nothings, wastrels, clay-whitened pot-girls, who had to work even on that day, and who had run out for a few moments in their flannel aprons to stare, and a few score ragamuffins whose parents were too poor or too careless to make them superficially presentable enough to figure in a procession. Nearly the whole respectability of the town was either fussily marshalling processions or gazing down at them in comfort from the multitudinous open windows of the Square. The leads over the projecting windows of Baines, the chief drapers, were crowded with members of the ruling caste. And even within the Square it could be seen, between the towering backs of constables, that the spectacle itself was chiefly made up of indigents bedecked. The thousands of perspiring children, penned like sheep and driven to and fro like sheep by anxious and official rosettes, nearly all had the air of poverty decently putting the best face on itself. They were nearly all, beneath their vague sense of importance, wistful with the resigned fatalism of the young and of the governed. They knew not precisely why they were there, but merely that they had been commended to be there, and that they were hot and thirsty, and that for weeks they had been learning hymns by heart for this occasion, and that the occasion was glorious. Many of the rosettes themselves had a poor, driven look. None of these bought suits at Shillitoe's nor millinery at Baines's. None of them gave orders for printing, nor had preferences in the form of ledgers, nor held views on Victor Hugo, nor drank wine, nor yearned for perfection in the art of social intercourse. To Edwin, who was just beginning to touch the planes of worldliness and of dilettantism in art, to Edwin, with the mysterious and haughty creature at his elbow, they seemed to have no more in common with himself and her than animals had. And he wondered by virtue of what decree he, in the Shillitoe suit, and the grand house waiting for him up at Bleakridge, had been lifted up to splendid ease above the squalid and pitiful human welter. THREE. Such musings were scarcely more than subconscious in him. He stood now a few inches behind Hilda, and above these thoughts, and beneath the stir and strident glitter and noise of the crawling ant-heap, his mind was intensely occupied with Hilda's ear and her nostril. He could watch her now at leisure, for the changeful interest of the scene made conversation unnecessary and even inept. What a lobe! What a nostril! Every curve of her features seemed to express a fine arrogant acrimony and harsh truculence. At any rate, she was not half alive. She was alive in every particle of herself. She gave off antipathies as a liquid gives off vapour. Moods passed across her intent face like a wind over a field. Apparently she was so rapt as to be unaware that her sunshade was not screening her. Sadness prevailed among her moods. The mild Edwin said secretly, "By Jove, if I had you to myself, my lady, I'd soon teach you a thing or two." He was quite sincere too. His glance, roving, discovered Mrs Hamps above him, 10 feet over his head, at the corner of the Baines' balcony. He flushed, for he perceived that she must have been waiting to catch him. She was at her most stately and most radiant, wonderful in lavender, and she poured out on him the full opulence of a proud recognition. Everybody should be made aware that Mrs Hamps was greeting her adored nephew, who was with a lady friend of the Orgreaves. She leaned slightly from her cane chair. "Isn't it a beautiful sight?" she cried. Her voice sounded thin and weak against the complex din of the Square. He nodded, smiling. "Oh, I think it's a beautiful sight!" she cried, once more ecstatic. People turned to see whom she was addressing. But though he nodded again, he did not think it was a beautiful sight. He thought it was a disconcerting sight, a sight vexatious and troublesome, and he was in no way tranquillised by the reflection that every town in England had the same sight to show at that hour. And moreover, anticipating their next interview, he could in fancy plainly hear his Aunt Clara saying, with hopeless longing benignancy, "Oh, Edwin, how I do wish I could have seen you in the Square, bearing your part!" Hilda seemed to be oblivious of Mrs Hamps's ejaculations, but immediately afterwards she straightened her back, with a gesture that Edwin knew, and staring into his eyes, said, as it were resentfully, "Well, they evidently aren't here," and looked with scorn among the sightseers. It was clear that the crowd contained nobody of the rank and stamp of the Orgreaves. "They may have gone up to the Cock Yard, if you know where that is," said Edwin. "Well, don't you think we'd better find them somehow?" CHAPTER XII. Of Clayhanger, by Arnold Bennett. CHAPTER XII. The Top of the Square. In making the detour through the Cock Yard to reach St Luke's Square again at the top of it, the only members of the Orgreave clan whom they encountered were Jimmie and Johnnie, who, on hearing of the disappearance of their father and Janet, merely pointed out that their father and Janet were notoriously always getting themselves lost, owing to gross carelessness about whatever they happened to be doing. The youths then departed, saying that the Bursley show was nothing, and that they were going to Hanbridge. They conveyed the idea that Hanbridge was the only place in the world for self-respecting men of fashion. But before leaving they informed Edwin that a fellow at the corner of the Square was letting out rather useful barrels on lease. This fellow proved to be an odd jobman who had been discharged from the Duke of Wellington vaults in the market place for consistently intemperate language, but whose tongue was such that he had persuaded the landlord on this occasion to let him borrow 12 stout empty barrels, and the police to let him dispose them on the pavement. Every barrel was occupied, and, perceiving this, Edwin at once became bold with the barrel man. He did not comfortably fancy himself perched prominent on a barrel with Hilda Lessways by his side, but he could enjoy talking about it, and he wished to show Hilda that he could be as dashing as those young sparks, Jimmie and Johnnie. "Now, mester," shouted the barrel man thickly, in response to Edwin's airy remark, "these 'ere two chaps'll shunt off for the price of a quart." He indicated a couple of barrel tenants of his own tribe, who instantly jumped down, touching their soiled caps. They were part of the barrel man's machinery for increasing profits. Edwin could not withdraw. His very cowardice forced him to be audacious. By the time he had satisfied the clawing greed of 3 dirty hands, the 2 barrels had cost him a shilling. Hilda's only observation was, as Edwin helped her to the plateau of the barrel, "I do wish they wouldn't spit on their money." All barrels being now let to bona fide tenants and paid for, the 3 men sidled hastily away in order to drink luck to Sunday schools in the Duke of Wellington's entire. And Edwin, mounting the barrel next to Hilda's, was thinking, "I've been done over that job. I ought to have got them for 6d." He saw how expensive it was, going about with delicately nurtured women. Never would he have offered a barrel to Maggie, and even had he done so, Maggie would assuredly have said that she could make shift well enough without one. "It's simply perfect for seeing!" exclaimed Hilda, as he achieved her altitude. Her tone was almost cordial. He felt surprisingly at ease. TWO. The whole Square was now suddenly revealed as a swarming mass of heads, out of which rose banners and pennons that were cruder in tint even than the frocks and hats of the little girls and the dresses and bonnets of their teachers. The men, too, by their neckties, scarves, and rosettes, added colour to colour. All the windows were chromatic with the hues of bright costumes, and from many windows and from every roof that had a flagstaff, flags waved heavily against the gorgeous sky. At the bottom of the square the lorries with infants had been arranged, and each looked like a bank of variegated flowers. The principal bands, that is to say all the bands that could be trusted, were collected round the red baize platform at the top of the square, and the vast sun-reflecting euphoniums, trumpets, and comets made a glittering circle about the officials and ministers and their wives and women. All denominations, for one day only, fraternised effusively together on that platform. For princes of the royal house and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Mayor of London had urged that it should be so. The primitive Methodist parson discovered himself next but one to Father Milton, who on any other day would have been a popish priest, and whose wooden substitute for a wife was the Queen on a chessboard. And on all these the sun blazed torridly. And almost in the middle of the square an immense purple banner bellied in the dusty breeze, saying in large gold letters, "The blood of the Lamb," together with the name of some Sunday school which Edwin from his barrel could not decipher. Then a hoary white-tied notability on the platform raised his mighty arm very high, and a bugle called, and a voice that had filled fields in exciting times of religious revival floated in thunder across the enclosed square, easily dominating it. "Let us sing!" And the conductor of the eager massed band set them free with a gesture, and after they had played a stave, a small stentorian choir at the back of the platform broke forth, and in a moment the entire multitude, at first raggedly, but soon in good unison, was singing: "Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. Let the water and the blood from thy riven side which flowed be of sin the double cure, cleanse from guilt and make me pure." The volume of sound was overwhelming. Its crashing force was enough to sweep people from barrels. Edwin could feel moisture in his eyes, and he dared not look at Hilda. "Why the deuce do I want to cry?" he asked himself angrily, and was ashamed. And at the beginning of the second verse, when the glittering instruments blared forth anew, and the innumerable voices, high and loud, infantile and aged, flooded swiftly over their brassy notes, subduing them, the effect on Edwin was the same again: a tightening of the throat and a squeezing down of the eyelids. Why was it? Through a mist he read the words, "The blood of the Lamb," and he could picture the riven trunk of a man dying, and a torrent of blood flowing therefrom, and people like his Auntie Clara and his brother-in-law Albert plunging ecstatically into the liquid in order to be white. The picture came again in the third verse: the red fountains and the frantic bathers. Then the notability raised his arm once more and took off his hat. And all the males on the platform took off their hats, and presently every boy and man in the square had uncovered his head to the strong sunshine. And at last Edwin had to do the same, and only the policemen, by virtue of their high office, could dare to affront the majesty of God. And the reverberating voice cried: "O most merciful Lord, have pity upon us! We are brands plucked from the burning," and continued for several minutes to descant upon the theme of everlasting torture by incandescence and thirst, nominally addressing a deity, but in fact preaching to his audience. He announced that even for the veriest infant on a lorry there was no escape from the eternal fires save by complete immersion in the blood. And he was so convinced and convincing that an imaginative nose could have detected the odour of burnt flesh. And all the while the great purple banner waved insistently, the blood of the Lamb. THREE. When the prayer was finished for the benefit of the little ones, another old and favourite hymn had to be sung. None but the classical lyrics of British Christianity had found a place in the programme of the great day. Guided by the orchestra, the youth of Bursley, and the maturity thereof, chanted with gusto: "There is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains. Dear dying Lamb, thy precious blood." Edwin, like everybody, knew every line of the poem. With the purple banner waving there a bloody motto, he foresaw each sanguinary detail of the verse ere it came to him from the shrill childish throats. And a phrase from another hymn jumped from somewhere in his mind, just as William Cowper's ended and a speech commenced. The phrase was "India's coral strand." In thinking upon it he forgot to listen to the speech. He saw the flags, banners, and pennons floating in the sunshine and in the heavy breeze. He felt the reverberation of the tropic sun on his head. He saw the crowded humanity of the Square, attired in its crude primary colours. He saw the great brass serpentine instruments gleaming. He saw the red dais. He saw, bursting with infancy, the immense cams to which were attached the fantastically plaited horses. He saw the venerable zealots on the dais, raving lest after all the institutions whose centenary they had met to honour should not save these children from hopeless and excruciating torture for ever and ever. He saw those majestic purple folds in the centre embroidered with the legend of the blood of the mystic paschal Lamb. He saw the meek, stupid, and superstitious faces, all turned one way, all for the moment under the empire of one horrible idea, all convinced that the consequences of sins could be prevented by an act of belief, all gloating over inexhaustible tides of blood. And it seemed to him that he was not in England any longer. It seemed to him that in the dim cellars under the shambles behind the Town Hall, where he had once been, there dwelt, squatting, a strange and savage God who would blast all those who did not enter his presence dripping with gore, be they child or grandfather. It seemed to him that the drums were tom-toms and bains a bazaar. He could fit every detail of the scene to harmonise with a vision of India's coral strand. There was no mist before his eyes now. His sight was so clear that he could distinguish his father at a window of the Bank, at the other top corner of the Square. Part of his mind was so idle that he could wonder how his father had contrived to get there, and whether Maggie was staying at home with Clara. But the visualisation of India's coral strand in St Luke's Square persisted. A phrase in the speech loosed some catch in him, and he turned suddenly to Hilda, and in an intimate half whisper murmured, "More blood." "What?" she harshly questioned, but he knew that she understood. "Well," he said audaciously, "look at it. It only wants the Ganges at the bottom of the Square." No one heard save she, but she put her hand on his arm protestingly. "Even if we don't believe," said she, not harshly but imploringly, "we needn't make fun. We don't believe." That new tone of entreaty she had comprehended without explanation. She was a weird woman. Was there another creature, male or female, to whom he would have dared to say what he had said to her? He had chosen to say it to her because he despised her, because he wished to trample on her feelings. She roused the brute in him, and perhaps no one was more astonished than himself to witness the brute stirring. Imagine saying to the gentle and sensitive Janet, "It only wants a Ganges at the bottom of the Square." He could not. They stood silent, gazing and listening, and the sun went higher in the sky and blazed down more cruelly. And then the speech ended, and the speaker wiped his head with an enormous handkerchief, and the multitude, led by the brazen instruments, which in a moment it overpowered, was singing to a solemn air. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride." Hilda shook her head. "What's the matter?" he asked, leaning towards her from his barrel. "That's the most splendid religious verse ever written," she said passionately. "You can say what you like. It's worth while believing anything if you can sing words like that and mean them." She had an air of restrained fury. But fancy exciting herself over a hymn! "Yes, it is fine, that is," he agreed. "Do you know who wrote it?" she demanded menacingly. "I'm afraid I don't remember," he said. The hymn was one of his earliest recollections, but it had never occurred to him to be curious as to its authorship. Her lips sneered. "Dr. Watts, of course!" she snapped. He could hear her, beneath the tremendous chanting from the Square, repeating the words to herself with her precise and impressive articulation. Volume 2, Chapter 12. Chapter 13. Of Clayhanger, by Arnold Bennett. This recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER 13. The Oldest Sunday school Teacher. From the elevation of his barrel, Edwin could survey, in the lordly and negligent manner of people on a height, all the detail of his immediate surroundings. Presently, in common with Hilda and the other aristocrats of barrels, he became aware of the increased vivacity of a scene which was passing at a little distance, near a hokey-pokey barrow. The chief actors in the affair appeared to be a young policeman, the owner of the hokey-pokey barrow, and an old man. It speedily grew into one of those episodes which, occurring on the outskirts of some episode immensely greater, draw too much attention to themselves, and thereby outrage the sense of proportion residing in most plain men, and especially in most policemen. "Give him a ha'porth of hokey," said a derisive voice. "He hasn't got a tooth in his head, but it wants no chewing, hokey doesna." There was a general guffaw from the little rabble about the barrow. "Aye, give us some o' that!" said the piping, silly voice of the old man. "But I mun get to that there platform, I'm telling ye." "I'm telling all of ye." He made a senile plunge against the body of the policeman, as against a moveless barricade, and then his hat was awry, and it fell off, and somebody lifted it into the air with a neat kick, so that it dropped on the barrow. All laughed. The old man laughed. "Now, old sodger," said the hot policeman curtly, "none o' this! None o' this! I advise ye civilly to be quiet. That's what I advise ye. You can't go on the platform without a ticket." "Nay," piped the old man. "Don't I tell ye I lost it down the Sytch?" "And where's your rosette?" "Never had any rosette," the old man replied. "I'm the oldest Sunday school teacher in the Five Towns. Aye, 50 years and more since I was super at Turnhill Primitive Sunday School. And all Turnhill knows it. And I've got to get on that there platform. I'm the oldest Sunday school teacher in the Five Towns, and I was super..." Two ribald youngsters intoned "Super, super," and another person unceremoniously jammed the felt hat on the old man's head. "It's nowt to me if you was 40 supers," said the policeman, with menacing disdain. "I've got my orders, and I'm not here to be knocked about. Where did ye have your last drink?" "No wine, no beer, nor spirituous liquors have I tasted for 61 years, come Martinmas," whimpered the old man, and he gave another lurch against the policeman. "My name's Shushions," and he repeated in a frantic treble, "My name's Shushions." "Go and bury thysen, old gaffer," a herculean young collier advised him. "Why," murmured Hilda, with a sharp frown, "that must be poor old Mr Shushions from Turnhill, and they're guying him. You must stop it. Something must be done at once." She jumped down feverishly, and Edwin had to do likewise. He wondered how he should conduct himself so as to emerge creditably from the situation. He felt himself, and had always felt himself, to be the last man in the world capable of figuring with authority in a public altercation. He loathed public altercations. The name of Shushions meant nothing to him. He had forgotten it, if indeed he had ever wittingly heard it, and he did not at first recognise the old man. Descended from the barrel, he was merely an item in the loose-packed crowd. As, in the wake of Hilda, he pushed with false eagerness between stubborn shoulders, he heard the band striking up again. TWO. Approaching, he saw that the old man was very old. And then memory stirred. He began to surmise that he had met the wizened face before, that he knew something about it. And the face brought up a picture of the shop door, and of his father standing beside it a long time ago. He recalled his last day at school. Yes, of course, this was the old man named Shushions, some sort of an acquaintance of his father's. This was the old man who had wept a surprising tear at the sight of him, Edwin. The incident was so far off that it might have been recorded in history books. He had never seen Mr Shushions since. And the old man was changed, nearly out of recognition. The old man had lived too long. He had survived his dignity. He was now nothing but a bundle of capricious and obstinate instincts, set in motion by ancient souvenirs remembered at hazard. The front of his face seemed to have given way in general collapse. The lips were in a hollow, the cheeks were concave, the eyes had receded, and there were pits in the forehead. The pale, silvery, straggling hairs might have been counted. The wrinkled skin was of a curious brown yellow, and the veins, instead of being blue, were outlined in Indian red. The impression given was that the flesh would be unpleasant and uncanny to the touch. The body was bent, and the neck eternally cricked backwards in the effort of the eyes to look up. Moreover, the old man was in a state of neglect. His beard alone proved that. His clothes were dirty and had the air of concealing dirt. And he was dressed with striking oddness. He wore boots that were not a pair. His collar was only fastened by one button behind. The ends oscillated like wings. He had forgotten to fasten them in front. He had forgotten to put on a necktie. He had forgotten the use of buttons on all his garments. He had grown down into a child again. But Providence had not provided him with a nurse. Worse than these merely material phenomena was the mumbling, toothless gibber of his shrill protesting, the glassy look of idiocy from his fatigued eyes, and the inane smile and impotent frown that alternated on his features. He was a horrible and offensive old man. He was Time's obscene victim. Edwin was revolted by the spectacle of the younger men baiting him. He was astonished that they were so short-sighted as not to be able to see the image of themselves in the old man, so imprudent as not to think of their own future, so utterly brutalised. He wanted, by the simple force of desire, to seclude and shelter the old man, to protect the old man not only from the insults of stupid and crass bullies, but from the old man himself, from his own fatuous senility. He wanted to restore to him, by a benevolent system of pretences, the dignity and the self-respect which he had innocently lost, and so to keep him decent to the eye, if not to the ear, until death came to repair its omission. And it was for his own sake, for the sake of his own image, as much as for the sake of the old man, that he wanted to do this. THREE. All that flashed through his mind and heart in a second. "I know this old gentleman. At least I know him by sight," Hilda was saying to the policeman. "He's very well known in Turnhill as an old Sunday school teacher, and I'm sure he ought to be on that platform." Before her eye, and her precise and haughty voice, which had no trace of the local accent, the young policeman was secretly abashed, and the louts fell back sheepishly. "Yes, he's a friend of my father's, Mr Clayhanger, printer," said Edwin behind her. The old man stood blinking in the glare. The policeman, ignoring Hilda, glanced at Edwin and touched his cap. "His friends hadn't oughter let him out like this, sir. Just look at him!" he sneered, and added, "I'm on point duty. If you ask me, I should say his friends ought to take him home." He said this with a peculiar mysterious emphasis, and looked furtively at the louts for moral support in sarcasm. They encouraged him with grins. "He must be got on to the platform somehow," said Hilda, and glanced at Edwin as if counting absolutely on Edwin. "That's what he's come for. I'm sure it means everything to him." "Aye!" the old man droned. "I was super when we had to teach 'em their alphabet and give 'em a crust to start with. Many's the man walking about in these towns in purple and fine raiment as I taught his letters to, and his spellings, aye, and his multiplication table, in them days." "That's all very well, miss," said the policeman. "But who's going to get him to the platform? He'll be dropping in a sunstroke afore ye can say knife." "Can't we?" She gazed at Edwin appealingly. "Tak' him into th' pub," growled the collier, audacious. At the same moment two rosettes bustled up authoritatively. One of them was the burly Albert Benbow. For the first time Edwin was conscious of genuine pleasure at the sight of his brother in law. Albert was a born rosette. "What's all this? What's this? What is it?" he said sharply. "Hello! What? Mr Shushions!" He bent down and looked close at the old man. "Where you been, old gentleman?" He spoke loud in his ear. "Everybody's been asking for you. Service is well nigh over, but ye must come up." The old man did not appear to grasp the significance of Albert's patronage. Albert turned to Edwin and winked, not only for Edwin's benefit, but for that of the policeman, who smiled in a manner that infuriated Edwin. "Queer old stick!" Albert murmured. "No doing anything with him. He's quarrelled with every one at Turnhill. That's why he wanted to come to us. And of course we weren't going to refuse the oldest Sunday school teacher in the Five Towns. He's a catch. Come along, old gentleman." Mr Shushions did not stir. "Now, Mr Shushions," Hilda persuaded him in a voice exquisitely mild, and with a lovely gesture she bent over him. "Let these gentlemen take you up to the platform. That's what you've come for, you know." The transformation in her amazed Edwin, who could see the tears in her eyes. The tableau of the little silly old man looking up, and Hilda looking down at him, with her lips parted in a heavenly invitation, and one gloved hand caressing his greenish black shoulder and the other mechanically holding the parasol aloft, this tableau was imprinted for ever on Edwin's mind. It was a vision blended in an instant, and in an instant dissolved. But for Edwin it remained one of the epochal things of his experience. Hilda gave Edwin her parasol, and quickly fastened Mr Shushions's collar, and the old man consented to be led off between the two rosettes. The bands were playing the Austrian hymn. "Like to come up with your young lady friend?" Albert whispered to Edwin importantly as he went. "Oh no, thanks!" Edwin hurriedly smiled. "Now, old gentleman," he could hear Albert adjuring Mr Shushions, and he could see him broadly winking to the other rosettes and embracing the yielding crowd in his wink. Thus the doddering old fool who had given his youth to Sunday schools when Sunday schools were not patronised by princes, archbishops, and lord mayors, when Sunday schools were the scorn of the intelligent and had sometimes to be held in public houses for lack of better accommodation, thus was he taken off for a show and a museum curiosity by indulgent and shallow Samaritans, who had not even the wit to guess that he had sown what they were reaping. And Darius Clayhanger stood oblivious at a high window of the Sacred Bank, and Edwin, who all unconscious owed the very fact of his existence to the doting imbecile, regarded him chiefly as a figure in a tableau, as the chance instrument of a woman's beautiful revelation. Mr Shushions's sole crime against society was that he had forgotten to die. FOUR. Hilda Lessways would not return to the barrels. She was taciturn, and the only remark which she made bore upon the advisability of discovering Janet and Mr Orgreave. They threaded themselves out of the moving crowd and away from the hokey pokey stall and the barrels into the tranquillity of the market place, where the shadow of the gold angel at the top of the Town Hall spire was a mere squat shapeless stain on the irregular paving stones. The sound of the festival came diminished from the Square. "You're very fond of poetry, aren't you?" Edwin asked her, thinking among many other things of her observation upon the verse of Isaac Watts. "Of course," she replied disagreeably. I can't imagine anybody wanting to read anything else." She seemed to be ashamed of her kindness to Mr Shushions, and to wish to efface any impression of amiability that she might have made on Edwin. But she could not have done so. "Well," he said to himself, "there's no getting over it. You're the biggest caution I've ever come across." His condition was one of various agitation. Then, just as they were passing the upper end of the Cock Yard, which was an archway, Mr Orgreave and Janet appeared in the archway. "We've been looking for you everywhere. And so have we. What have you been doing? What have you been doing?" Father and daughter were gay. They had not seen much, but they were gay. Hilda Lessways and Edwin were not gay, and Hilda would characteristically make no effort to seem that which she was not. Edwin, therefore, was driven by his own diffidence into a nervous light loquacity. He began the tale of Mr Shushions, and Hilda punctuated it with stabs of phrases. Mr Orgreave laughed. Janet listened with eager sympathy. "Poor old thing! What a shame!" said Janet. But to Edwin, with the vision of Hilda's mercifulness in his mind, even the sympathy of Janet for Mr Shushions had a quality of uncomprehending, facile condescension which slightly jarred on him. The steam car loitered into view, discharged 2 passengers, and began to manoeuvre for the return journey. "Oh, do let's go home by car, father!" cried Janet. "It's too hot for anything." Edwin took leave of them at the car steps. Janet was the smiling incarnation of loving kindness. Hilda shook hands grudgingly. Through the windows of the car he saw her sternly staring at the advertisements of the interior. He went down the Cock Yard into Wedgwood Street, whence he could hear the bands again and see the pennons. He thought: "This is a funny way of spending a morning," and wondered what he should do with himself till dinner time. It was not yet 12:15. Still the hours had passed with extraordinary speed. He stood aimless at the corner of the pavement, and people who, having had their fill of the sun and the spectacle in the Square, were strolling slowly away, saw a fair young man in a stylish suit, evidently belonging to the aloof classes, gazing at nothing whatever, with his hands elegantly in his pockets. CHAPTER XIII. VOLUME 2.